Hello? My name is Nicole. My mom once texted me, "You won't be joining us. We're keeping it private. For good reason." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just forgotten, I was erased. They cropped me out of photos, untagged my name online, even returned the gifts I bought for my niece. And behind every smile they posted, there was a deeper betrayal. Papers signed, doors locked, my father's words hidden away. How far would your own family go to silence you? I came home that Wednesday evening the same way I always did. Keys tossed into the ceramic dish by the door, bag slipped off my shoulder, shoes lined up neatly on the rug. My body still carried the weight of a long day teaching, the kind of exhaustion that settles in your bones and makes every small ritual feel heavier than it should. I filled the kettle, pulled down my favorite mug, and reached for the tin of chamomile. The house was quiet, save for the creak of the floorboards under my steps and the faint hum of the refrigerator. When I sat down at the small oak table by the window, I let my breath slow. I usually treasured this part of the day, the space where I could exhale, read a little, or let my thoughts wander. My father used to tell me that solitude could be a friend if you knew how to listen to it. Since he passed, I tried to believe that, though sometimes solitude felt more like a stubborn shadow than a companion. I had just taken the first sip of tea when my phone buzzed across the table. I glanced down, and my mother's name lit the screen. For a split second, warmth flickered in me. It had been weeks since we spoke properly, and I let myself hope it might be an invitation, a word of kindness, some recognition that despite the distance I was still part of the family. The text preview appeared. My hand trembled before I even opened it, as if my body already knew what my mind hadn't yet faced. "You won't be joining us. We're keeping it private. For good reason." I blinked hard, reading it again, then again, as though repetition could alter the meaning. Each word pressed against me like a stone. For good reason. Those 3 words carried more coldness than if she had said nothing at all. I sat back, my tea cooling rapidly on the table, and felt my chest tighten. The apartment that a moment ago felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I whispered aloud, "For good reason." What reason could justify cutting out your own daughter? My voice cracked in the silence, swallowed quickly by the walls. I checked the screen for another message, an explanation, an apology, even a typo to suggest I had misunderstood. But nothing came, just that single sentence. I pressed the call button, holding the phone to my ear, listening to it ring and ring until voicemail picked up. I didn't leave a message. I just stared at the black screen, her words replaying in my mind. Growing up, family dinners were loud affairs, siblings talking over one another, my father telling stories, my mother orchestrating the plates and dishes. It was messy, imperfect, but it was together. That was what family meant to me. Now, togetherness had turned conditional, like some test I had already failed. I thought of how in this country, we idealize reunions, barbecues, Thanksgiving tables filled with laughter and too much food. We tell ourselves family is the anchor when life feels adrift. But sitting there, I realized my family's anchor was designed to keep me out, not hold me in place. The betrayal stung sharper because it came in writing. Words on a screen lacked tone, lacked warmth, lacked any chance of softening with a pause or a sigh. They were deliberate, stripped of compassion, final. I set the phone down, but couldn't resist picking it up again, as though a second look would alter reality. My heart pounded in my ears. I wanted to demand an answer, to say, "I am your daughter, not some outsider." But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. The silence after that text was its own message. My instinct was to scroll, to look for clues, to make sense of this sudden exclusion. I tapped open our family group chat, the one where we used to share updates, plan birthdays, trade photos of the kids. Only it looked strange, quiet, outdated. I hadn't received any notifications in weeks. I typed, "Hey, what's going on this weekend?" No reply. The gray checkmark sat there like a sneer. Hours later, a cousin accidentally forwarded a screenshot meant for someone else. My eyes locked on the names stacked neatly in the chat, everyone but me. Their plans sprawled across the thread, who was bringing what time they'd meet, reminders about reservations. In the middle of the conversation, one line froze me in place. Don't tell Nicole. It's better this way. I whispered those words under my breath, tasting the bitterness of them. Better this way. For who? For them, perhaps. For their peace, their comfort, their curated picture of family that excluded the one who had apparently become inconvenient. The irony wasn't lost on me. We talk so often about freedom and fairness in this country, about giving everyone a seat at the table, but sometimes the cruelest unfairness is dealt not by strangers, but by the people whose last name you share. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the city street below. A couple walked by, laughing, their shadows long under the street lamp. Somewhere in another apartment, music floated faintly through the night. Life carried on, while mine felt paused by a single sentence and a screenshot. I poured myself another cup of tea, though I didn't drink it. The steam curled upward, dissipating too quickly, much like the hope I had felt when I first saw my mother's name on my screen. My thoughts drifted to my father. He would never have allowed this. He believed family was built on inclusion, even when it was messy, even when tempers clashed. He used to say, "Blood may bind us, but it's respect that keeps us together." Looking at my phone, I realized this wasn't sudden. It had been building for years. Small exclusions, dismissive remarks, moments where I was left out of photos or decisions. I told myself then it wasn't intentional, that families stumble, that one day it would balance. But now, the mask had slipped. This was intentional. There's a saying I've heard more than once. Blood is thicker than water. Tonight, it felt like water might be kinder. I set the phone face down on the table, the screen dark. My fingers itched to type a reply, to call again, to plead for an explanation. But pleading had never earned me respect, and I wasn't about to start now. Instead, I let the silence settle, this time on my terms. Silence could be a shield, not just a prison. I looked around my apartment, the books stacked on the shelves, the framed photo of my father smiling on the mantel, the cozy quilt folded on the couch. These were reminders of who I was, even if my family tried to erase me. If they think erasing me is simple, I whispered into the room, they don't know me anymore. That night, I promised myself this story wouldn't end with a text. The morning light crept through the blinds, but I had barely slept. My mother's text from the night before still pulsed through me, each word replaying like a cruel refrain. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe it was a moment of harshness that could be undone. Yet something in me knew better. By mid-morning, I grabbed my keys and told myself I just needed to see with my own eyes. The drive through Portland was familiar, but every stoplight felt longer than usual. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. As I pulled onto the street where I had spent much of my childhood, my chest tightened. There were more cars parked out front than usual, some I didn't recognize. The blinds in the living room were pulled halfway, a clumsy attempt at privacy, but through the slats I could see shadows moving. The faint sound of voices carried through the open kitchen window. I slowed my car and parked a little ways down. I stepped out, the air crisp, my heart heavier with every step toward the house. I paused near the hedge that lined the yard. From that angle, I could see the wall just beyond the living room window. On it hung a new photo, framed and centered proudly. My siblings, their children, my mother standing tall in the middle, all smiling. I scanned the faces, my eyes desperate for mine. But I wasn't there. I pressed a hand to the cold wood of the fence. It's one thing to forget to invite someone. It's another to remove them from the frame altogether. That photo wasn't missing me by accident. It was a declaration. Life carried on, and I was written out. My breath fogged against the glass as I leaned closer, a foolish impulse to look again, as if a second glance would reveal my face tucked in the corner. But all I saw were the happy expressions of everyone else. From inside came the sound of laughter, muffled but clear enough to sting. They were already living a version of family that no longer had space for me. I thought of the words from my mother's message. We're keeping it private, for good reason. Seeing that photo, I understood. Their reason was to erase me, not quietly, but decisively. I stood frozen, debating whether to knock. If I walked through that door, I'd be an intruder in my own family's home. The humiliation would be unbearable. So I turned back toward my car, each step echoing louder than the last. Driving away, I couldn't stop replaying the scene, the blinds half drawn, the laughter, that picture. Exclusion doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through what isn't there, your absence where you should have been. By the time I got back to my apartment, bitterness had settled deep, but along with it came something steadier: resolve. I sank into the couch and pulled my phone from my bag. Maybe distraction would help, or maybe evidence would solidify what I already knew. Scrolling through social media, I stumbled onto a post from a relative. At first, it looked harmless: kids grinning, adults holding coffee cups, everyone wearing bright matching shirts. But as my eyes focused, I saw the print across each shirt: names, my brother, my sister, my nieces, even my mother. I searched frantically for mine, but it wasn't there. No shirt waiting for me, no space reserved. The comments underneath twisted the knife deeper. "What a beautiful family," one read. Another said, "Everyone's here, looks perfect." Perfect. Everyone was there except me, and to the outside world, it was seamless. I whispered to myself, "Everyone except me." My voice was flat, not sad, just factual. They had already written me out. The humiliation burned, but layered under it was clarity. This wasn't oversight. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. A shirt without my name said more than words ever could. Families in this country often talk about inclusion, making room, pulling up another chair. I thought of an old saying: if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. That day, I understood it. They had made me invisible for their own comfort. I put the phone down, forcing my hands to be still, though inside I was vibrating with anger. The apartment was silent, but my mind sharpened in that silence. They thought exclusion would weaken me, but it did the opposite. I stood by the window, looking at the street below, and thought about the values my father taught me. He raised me to believe in fairness, in individuality, in speaking truth even when it was unpopular. America was built on those ideals, he said. You had a right to your voice, your place, your dignity. Those lessons were mine to carry, even if the people closest to me discarded them. I whispered aloud, steady now. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it's the first act of resistance. I knew then that begging for a seat would never work. Exclusion couldn't be fought with pleading. It had to be answered with strength and with proof. They wanted me gone, erased from photos, forgotten in shirts, excluded from plans. But they hadn't counted on what that would awaken in me. I sat down, folded my arms across the table, and felt something settle. An anchor, not in them, but in myself. They want me gone, I said softly, but I'm not done yet. When they erased my name from a shirt, they didn't realize they were stitching a stronger resolve into me. That night, the apartment felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves carried the echo of my mother's words and that photo I had seen through the window. I couldn't sit still. I wandered from the kitchen to the living room and back again, pacing in circles until finally I stopped at the closet in the hall. Tucked away in the very back, under an old quilt, was a wooden box I hadn't opened in years. My father had given it to me when I was still in college, telling me to keep the things that mattered, because one day they'd matter even more. I carried it to the coffee table and brushed away the thin layer of dust. My hands shook a little as I lifted the lid. Inside were scraps of my life: birthday cards, pressed flowers, my father's old watch that no longer worked but still smelled faintly of the aftershave he wore every Sunday, and at the bottom was a cassette recorder, the kind with buttons that clicked loudly when pressed. I stared at it for a long moment before sliding in one of the labeled tapes. The machine whirred to life, and then his voice filled the room. Deep, steady, warm, so achingly familiar that it stopped me cold. "Never forget, Nicole," he said. "You are the heart of this family." I pressed my hand to my mouth. Tears pricked my eyes before I even realized they were there. That single sentence stood in direct opposition to everything I'd been told these past days. They wanted me gone, invisible, forgotten. But here was my father's voice, reaching across time to remind me that I was more than the outsider they made me feel like. I rewound the tape and played it again and again. Each repetition wrapped around me like armor. I sat back in silence, staring at the recorder as if it held the key to everything I was losing. If my father were alive, he would never have allowed this. He had a sense of fairness that ran deep. Whenever we argued as kids, he made sure every one of us had a chance to speak, even if it took all night. He believed voices mattered. Mine mattered. But now, in the silence from my mother and siblings, I heard the opposite message. My voice was inconvenient. My absence, convenient. Justice delayed is justice denied, I whispered, thinking of the phrase I'd heard often in civics classes. My father's words on that tape felt like delayed justice, but they were still justice. They were still truth. And I wasn't about to let that truth be buried. Later, unable to sleep, I reached for my phone again. The glow lit up the room in a way that felt almost accusatory. Against my better judgment, I opened Facebook. There it was, a brand new album uploaded by my sister. The title read, "Family Weekend at Mom's." My stomach twisted. I clicked through. Photo after photo showed my siblings, their children, even my mother, all gathered in the very living room I had driven past earlier. Balloons, a cake, laughter frozen in pixels. I looked closer at the tags under each picture. My brother's name, my sister's, my nieces, nephews, even family friends. But my name, gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd been missed by accident, but then I saw the faint gray outline of where my name had been tagged and then deliberately removed, untagged. They didn't just leave me out. They made sure no one else would even know I had ever been part of it. The comments under the pictures were like salt in an open wound. "Everyone looks so happy together," one friend wrote. Another said, "So glad the whole family could be there." Whole, complete, perfect. I stared at the screen, my throat tightening. To the world, the family was intact. To the world, I didn't exist. My thoughts spiraled. They didn't just leave me out, they erased me. I imagined them sitting there, deciding, "Don't tag Nicole." It's better this way. Digital erasure felt no different than emotional erasure. It reinforced what I had already seen with my own eyes. They wanted a family narrative without me. And now, thanks to social media, they had one the entire world could see. I set the phone down hard on the table and pressed my palms to my eyes. Humiliation mixed with grief, but beneath it was something sharper, clarity. The world might see a perfect family portrait, but I knew the truth. And I carried proof in my father's voice, in his words that named me the heart of this family. I picked up the recorder again, listening one more time as his steady voice filled the room. It was as though he had left me instructions, reminding me that even when others silence you, the truth doesn't vanish. I leaned back in the chair and exhaled slowly. I had a choice. I could let their version of reality define me, or I could fight back, not with begging, not with pleas for inclusion, but with strength and evidence. "Silence can be golden," I said aloud, remembering another phrase I had heard often, "but sometimes it's a weapon." That night, I decided my silence would not be submission. It would be strategy. They could crop me from photos, untag my name, and laugh behind blinds half closed, but I wasn't going to disappear. "They may silence me online," I whispered, turning off the lamp, "but they cannot silence me in truth." And as I turned off the light, I knew their silence was only sharpening my voice. The morning after I played my father's tape on repeat, I woke unsettled. His words had been both a balm and a spark, soothing me while stirring a storm I couldn't ignore. I hadn't slept much, and when the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. But the screen lit with my mother's name, and I couldn't stop myself from picking up. Her voice was steady, clipped, as if she were discussing business rather than blood. "Nicole, you always take things too personally," she began. "We just want peace. Can't you understand that?" I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. "Peace?" I repeated. "Or silence?" She ignored me, pressing on. "Your presence creates tension. It's better for everyone if you give space. We're trying to keep things simple." Her words coiled around me like smoke, suffocating. This wasn't explanation. It was accusation dressed as reason. I recognized it instantly. Gaslighting. She was reframing my exclusion as though I had asked for it, as though I had brought it upon myself. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Peace without justice, I said slowly, is just silence. And silence isn't the same as peace. Her sigh on the other end carried both irritation and finality. Nicole, stop making this harder than it has to be. I'm not the one making it harder, I replied, and ended the call before she could twist the knife again. The click felt like slamming a door. For a moment I just sat there, heart racing, but also strangely relieved. I finally understood that no conversation with her would ever restore fairness. By afternoon, I couldn't sit still. I texted my brother Isidore, asking to meet. He agreed, suggesting a small coffee shop near downtown. Neutral ground. I told myself I needed clarity, but truthfully, I was searching for one last sliver of loyalty. When I arrived, he was already there, waving as though nothing unusual hung between us. He smiled, asked how work was going, even joked about the rain that had soaked Portland all week. We danced around the subject, sipping coffee, until I couldn't take it anymore. Did Dad leave something for me? I asked, my voice steady but firm. Did you see his letter? His smile faltered. He shifted in his chair, glanced toward the window. Mom thought it was best if I gave it to her, he admitted finally. She said it would only make things harder for you. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The betrayal hit harder than my mother's text. My own brother, the one who once promised he'd look out for me, had handed away the one thing that proved I still belonged. It's not the enemy that breaks you, I thought bitterly. It's when your own blood looks away. I leaned forward. Isidore, do you hear yourself? You gave away my voice. Do you even see what you've done? He raised his hands slightly, as if to calm me. Nicole, you don't understand. It's easier this way. Less drama. That phrase, less drama, sliced through me. My mother had used those exact words. I could almost hear her coaching him. My hands trembled, but I steadied my voice. You didn't protect peace. You protected control, and you gave her the power to erase me. His jaw tightened. I just want everyone to get along. Getting along isn't the same as being fair, I said. Dad understood that. He made space for every voice. You just helped shut mine out. A couple at the next table glanced our way, sensing the tension. I lowered my tone but sharpened the words. You've chosen convenience over truth. Don't ever call that loyalty. He looked down at his cup, unable to meet my eyes. For me, that silence was an answer. I knew then I could never rely on him again. I left the coffee shop without finishing my drink. The chill outside hit me hard, but I welcomed it. My feet carried me through Portland's streets while my mind replayed the conversation. My brother's betrayal cut deeper than my mother's dismissal because it confirmed how alone I really was in this fight. In America, siblings are supposed to be your first allies, I thought, watching people pass me on the sidewalk, friends laughing together, a couple holding hands, families gathered around late lunches. Mine just chose convenience over truth. The ache of that realization was sharp, but underneath it burned a steadier fire. I would stop expecting loyalty from those who benefited from my silence. If my own brother could hand away my truth, then I had only one choice left, to fight for it myself. That evening, when I turned the key in the lock and stepped into my apartment, I noticed a package sitting squarely on my doorstep. At first, I thought it might be something I had ordered weeks ago, but the handwriting on the label made my stomach twist. I recognized the loops and sharp strokes immediately. It was my mother's. I carried the box inside, set it on the table, and opened it with careful hands, though I already felt what I would find. Inside was the toy I had wrapped for my niece, a small dollhouse with miniature furniture that I'd chosen thoughtfully. I remembered walking the aisles of the store, picking it out because she loved to line up tiny objects and play house with her cousins. I had wrapped it in cheerful paper, written a card with a short note, "With love, from Aunt Nicole." Now it sat there untouched, returned to me as if I were some stranger sending the wrong package. On top was a folded note, my mother's handwriting again. "We already have everything we need." I sat heavily in the chair, staring at the words. This wasn't just a rejection of a present, it was a rejection of presence. I whispered aloud, "They're not just refusing my gift, they're refusing me." For a moment, I debated tossing the box into the trash chute, but then I stopped myself. Throwing it away would be letting them dictate the story. Keeping it, however, would be proof, a reminder of just how deliberate this cruelty was. I placed the toy back inside, folded the paper carefully, and slid it into the box. Evidence, a message loud enough to echo without sound. My father used to say, "Sometimes it's not what people say, but what they do that speaks the truth." I thought now, sometimes it's not even what they do, it's what they send back to your doorstep. The following morning, my phone rang again. My mother's name lit the screen. I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something inside urged me to answer. Her voice was crisp, controlled, like someone checking off a list. "Nicole," she began, "don't make this harder. We've decided. You won't be joining us." I closed my eyes and let the silence hang for a beat before answering. "Decided? You mean erased?" Her tone sharpened. "This isn't erasure. This is about keeping peace. You know how you can be. It's simpler this way. No one wants the drama." I let out a short laugh, bitter and sharp. "Peace without me is not peace. It's silence you can control." "Nicole," she said firmly, "you're being unreasonable again. This is exactly why we had to do this. You turn everything into conflict." She was twisting it, making me the problem, painting my pain as instability. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. This was gaslighting. She wanted me to believe my exclusion was my fault, that I had forced their hand. "I'm not unstable," I said, my voice steady. "You're rewriting the story because it suits you, but truth has a way of surviving, even when you bury it." Her sigh was exasperated, sharp. "You always think you know better. You've made your choice." "No," I replied, my grip on the phone tight. "You made yours, and now I'll make mine." Before she could answer, I ended the call. The finality of pressing that red button gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in days. I set the phone down, my heart pounding, but there was no trembling now, just clarity. That evening, I sat at my desk with the returned gift box beside me. The weight of it filled the room, a silent companion. I pulled out a sheet of paper, uncapped a pen, and began to write. Not a plea, not an apology, but a declaration. The words came slowly at first, then with conviction. "I will not be erased. You may silence my name in your gatherings, but you cannot erase the truth. I am part of this family, whether you acknowledge it or not." I paused, letting the ink dry, then continued. "What you call peace is simply control. I refuse to consent to being diminished. You have mistaken my quiet for weakness, but silence is sometimes the loudest answer." I didn't plan to send it, not yet. The act of writing itself was enough. It was the first brick in a wall of defense I was building around myself. As I folded the paper, I thought of Eleanor Roosevelt's words I'd once read in a book of quotes. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." Tonight, I finally understood. For too long, I had consented by staying quiet, by accepting the scraps of recognition they offered. I vowed then I would no longer consent. Later, I stepped outside. The dusk had painted Portland's sky in deep orange and violet, the streets alive with people heading to dinner, children laughing in strollers, couples holding hands. I walked slowly, watching families pass, feeling the pang of what I was denied, but instead of letting it hollow me out, I let it steal me. "They see me as weak," I murmured to myself, "but they'll be shocked at what silence can build." I knew then that my sorrow had shifted into something else. Strategy. They thought they could return a gift and send back my love, but what I was preparing to return would change everything. By the time Saturday arrived, I had already decided I would not let their silence cage me. They thought a text message and an untagged photo could stop me, but I was determined to see for myself. I left Portland just after noon, the sky heavy with coastal clouds as I drove west toward Cannon Beach. The 2-hour drive wound past forests and rivers, postcard-perfect landscapes that contrasted painfully with the heaviness in my chest. The closer I got, the more the beauty of Oregon's coastline felt like a cruel backdrop to what I knew was waiting for me. When I finally pulled into the narrow gravel lot beside the rented hall, I saw cars lined neatly in rows. My brother's truck, my sister's SUV, even my mother's sedan. It was clear. Everyone was there. A dull throb echoed in my chest, but I held my chin high. With every step I took toward that building, I reminded myself, these were my people too, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The hall itself looked ordinary, wooden siding, a small porch, windows trimmed with white paint, but to me, it felt like a fortress. As I climbed the steps, the faint sounds of laughter and music spilled out, muffled through the glass. I approached the door with purpose, gripping the strap of my bag, ready to walk in. Just before I reached for the handle, a young man in a staff uniform stepped forward. He held a clipboard, his smile polite but nervous. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, blocking the door. "Can I see your name, please?" "Nicole," I said. "I'm family." He ran his finger down the list, scanning quickly before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not listed." I felt the words like a blow. Not listed. The official stamp on what I had already known, but dreaded to confirm. My own blood had orchestrated my absence so carefully that even strangers were enlisted to enforce it. "This is my family," I said firmly. "My mother, my siblings. I belong in there." The young man shifted uncomfortably. "I understand, but I can't let anyone in who isn't on the list. I'm really sorry." The apology didn't soften the humiliation. To be turned away not by them directly, but by someone who didn't even know me. This was cruelty dressed in bureaucracy. I stood there, my reflection staring back at me in the locked glass. A woman excluded not only by her relatives, but also by the structure they had built to keep her out. Behind the door, I could hear voices rising and falling, bursts of laughter, the clinking of dishes, my brother's booming laugh, my sister's voice, sharp and animated, my mother's steady tone above them all. It was a family gathering, and I was the outsider to my own blood. I pulled my phone from my bag, thumb hovering over my mother's contact. For a heartbeat, I considered calling, demanding to be let in, forcing them to acknowledge me. But then I stopped. Pleading would only give them more power. They had locked the door. I would answer with silence, but this time on my terms. I turned slowly, walked back down the steps, and headed for my car. Each footstep was heavy, but inside, anger coiled into something sharper. Resolve. The drive back to Portland was a blur. The ocean stretched wide to my left, waves crashing rhythmically, indifferent to my pain. I tried to absorb its steadiness, its refusal to bend for anyone. By the time I reached my street, dusk had fallen. As I stepped out of my car, my neighbor, Mrs. Green, was watering her small row of hydrangeas. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Nicole, heard your family had a big event today. Must have been special." Her words, innocent and well-meaning, landed like glass shattering inside me. Not only was I excluded, but now the world around me believed I wasn't supposed to be there at all. To them, the story was simple, a happy family gathering. No one would imagine the missing face in the photo, the name erased from the list. I forced a smile, clutching my keys a little too tightly. "Something like that," I muttered. She nodded cheerfully, oblivious, and went back to her flowers. I hurried inside, my chest burning. Once back in the safety of my apartment, I collapsed into the chair by the window. The contrast gnawed at me. The breathtaking beauty of Cannon Beach, families laughing along the shore, versus the ugliness I had just endured at that hall. This was never about peace. It was about control, about erasing my voice so thoroughly that even neighbors believed the picture was whole without me. I whispered to myself, "Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who doesn't shut the door on you." I stared at the returned gift still sitting on the counter, my father's tape recorder nearby, the pieces of evidence of both cruelty and love. My silence would no longer be passive, It would be strategic. They had locked me out today, but I knew one thing. Doors can be broken and walls can come down. Monday morning, I woke up to the familiar buzz of my phone on the nightstand. I reached for it without thinking, my mind still foggy from a restless night. The screen glowed with a new message, my sister Safrona's name sitting bold at the top. For a second, I felt that little flicker of hope I always tried to kill off, that maybe, just maybe, she would be the one to reach out with something resembling kindness. I opened it, and there it was, written in her polished, practiced tone. Nicole, I've been thinking, it's probably better for you not to come next time. You'd feel out of place anyway. We're just trying to make this easier for everyone. I know you'll understand. I stared at the words, my mouth going dry. Easier for everyone. Out of place. She had woven her rejection with so much sugar that it almost disguised the poison. Almost. I whispered to myself, sometimes the sharpest knives are wrapped in sugar. It reminded me of the Southern phrase I'd once heard from a friend. Bless your heart. Everyone knew it wasn't a blessing at all. It was a knife dipped in honey. Sofrona had just given me my version of it. I typed out a reply, then deleted it. My fingers trembled with the urge to spit truth back at her, but I didn't. Instead, I placed the phone face down and sat still, letting the anger crawl under my skin. Later that morning, curiosity got the better of me. I picked the phone back up, opened social media, and immediately saw it. Sofrona had posted new photos from the weekend. They were all there again. My brother, his kids, my mother, nieces and nephews with frosting smeared across their faces, bright smiles, arms linked, the ocean shimmering in the background. At first glance, it looked like a glossy postcard of family unity. But then I noticed something else. My name had been tagged initially. I could see the faint trace of it in the metadata, but then removed, untagged, deliberately. It wasn't enough for them to exclude me physically. They wanted me erased digitally, too, ensuring that no outsider scrolling through their feeds would ever wonder why Nicole wasn't there. The narrative had to be seamless, a complete family without me. The comments rolled below the pictures, a chorus of approval. Beautiful family. Everyone looks so happy together. You're so lucky to have each other. I whispered into the empty apartment. Erasure and silence is one thing. Erasure for the world to see is another. Humiliation twisted into rage. It wasn't private anymore. It was public. And that cut deeper. I pulled the keyboard closer, began to type under one of the photos. Not everyone was there. But I stopped, staring at the words. If I posted, they'd twist it against me, prove their point that I was the one causing drama. Deleting it felt like swallowing glass, but restraint was power. I leaned back and closed my eyes. My father's voice from that old tape rose in my memory. Nicole, you are the heart of this family. The Eleanor Roosevelt quote followed right behind, something I'd scribbled into a notebook years ago. Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. And what were they doing, if not discussing me, excluding me, reshaping me into the villain of their tidy little tale? I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because silence would sharpen me. By late afternoon, the anger had settled into something colder. I sat at my desk, the returned gift box on one side and my notes spread on the other. Sofrona wasn't just playing backup to our mother. She was a willing executioner in my erasure. The smiley texts, the curated photos, the untagging, they weren't accidents. They were cuts delivered deliberately, the sweetest cuts, meant to leave no visible scar, but to bleed me dry all the same. I whispered, if Sofrona thinks sweet words can mask betrayal, she's about to learn how bitter truth can taste. That night, I pulled out a pad of paper and began writing. Not letters this time, but a ledger. I listed each slight, each exclusion, each erasure. From the birthday I wasn't invited to the Christmas sweater I never got, to the photos cropped without me, and now the digital untagging. The list was long, longer than I had let myself admit. Seeing it laid out wasn't just painful, it was clarifying. This fight wasn't about an invitation anymore. It wasn't about being added back to a group chat or a family album. It was about justice, about refusing to let them overwrite my existence. There's a saying I'd heard once: in America, we don't just let sleeping dogs lie when they bite. And they had bitten. I tapped the pen against the page, thinking of all the evidence I was gathering, every piece of proof that would one day dismantle their facade. My silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And if my sister wanted to cut me out with a smile, I was ready to answer with the sharp edge of truth. The week after Sophrona's message crawled by like a test of endurance. Every day I woke with the same burning thought: I couldn't let this continue. Their cruelty had moved past silence into spectacle, and I had been left standing outside doors while strangers told me I wasn't listed. That humiliation would have broken me once, but not now. I had something they didn't know I carried: my father's signature, his hidden letter, his voice preserved on paper as surely as it had been on tape. Each night I laid the documents out on my kitchen table. I studied the ink strokes, the slight tremor in his handwriting, the fading lines pressed into the paper by a hand no longer alive but still speaking. I inhaled the faint, musty smell of the envelope, as if the years it had sat untouched had preserved more than words: memory, presence, dignity. If he took the time to write this, I told myself aloud, I'll take the courage to show it. I thought of his values, how fairness had been his creed. And he believed protecting the vulnerable was the truest measure of strength. The family I had left behind had warped that legacy, twisting peace into submission, rewriting silence as order. But I still carried his standard. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The words of Martin Luther King Jr. rolled in my mind as I packed the documents into my bag. Saturday morning, before dawn had fully lit the streets of Portland, I started the car and drove toward Cannon Beach. By the time I reached the hall, the gravel lot was full again. I held my breath, squared my shoulders, and walked inside without knocking, without hesitation. The air stilled the moment I entered. Murmurs rippled through the room like a sudden wind. My sister's eyes widened. My brother shifted uncomfortably in his chair. My mother froze, her face hardening into ice. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice the room in half. I met her gaze steadily. I should have been here all along. Tension tightened the space. My siblings exchanged uneasy glances, whispers passing like sparks across dry grass. I stepped forward, unzipping my bag slowly. Then, without another word, I placed the folded letter on the table. The sound of paper sliding across wood was louder than any shout. Silence fell. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the faint hiss of the coffee pot in the corner. I picked up the letter, opened it, and began to read aloud. My father's words filled the hall as if he had stepped back into the room. "To my daughter, Nicole," it began, "never forget. You are part of this family's foundation. What I leave behind is yours as much as anyone's." The weight of those sentences pressed into the air like stone. Sophrona shifted in her chair, suddenly restless. Isidore looked down at the floor, his eyes refusing to meet mine. My mother broke the silence first. "That's old." "Things have changed." I lifted my eyes from the page. "Signatures don't expire. Truth doesn't change." A murmur rose from the back of the hall. A few family friends had been invited, and among them was Delphine, my father's old confidant and lawyer. She leaned forward, listening intently, her presence a reminder that this moment was not hidden. This confrontation had witnesses. I placed the letter flat on the table again, letting everyone see the unmistakable handwriting. The loops of his N, the firm cross on his T, the ink faded but still clear. This wasn't just memory, it was proof. My mother's voice rose, brittle with anger. "This isn't about truth, this is about keeping order." "Order built on silence isn't peace," I shot back. "It's control." Sophrona tried to interject, her voice dripping with that false sweetness. "Nicole, you're twisting things again. This isn't what Dad would have wanted." I cut her off sharply. "Don't you dare speak for him when his words are right here. He already spoke, and you've spent years trying to bury it." Inside me, the years of humiliation condensed into steel. Every slight, every exclusion, every erased photo, Every untagged post had led here, to this table, to this letter. I wasn't going to let it pass quietly. The room cracked open into division. A cousin muttered under his breath, "She's right." Another relative shook her head, siding with my mother. The atmosphere buzzed with fractured loyalties. I pressed my hand flat against the letter, my voice steady. "You can erase my name from photos, from shirts, from doors, but you cannot erase this, and you cannot erase me." The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. This one wasn't dismissive or cruel. It was stunned, heavy, unavoidable. And in that silence, I realized the battle had finally begun on my terms. Sunday morning, the sunlight had barely slipped past my blinds when my phone began buzzing. It wasn't the gentle ping of a calendar reminder or a casual text from a friend. It was relentless. The device vibrated against my nightstand until I finally grabbed it. Dozens of missed calls, text messages stacked like bricks. My chest tightened before I even read the first one. Some messages came in soft, dripping with false sympathy. "We didn't mean to hurt you this bad. Maybe we went too far." Others were sharp, almost threatening. "You're tearing this family apart. Stop now before it gets worse." My mother's voicemail was cold as stone. "Nicole, you've made a private matter public. You're embarrassing us. This is unnecessary drama." I set the phone down, staring at it as though it had become something alive, a battlefield buzzing with voices. For years I had lived with silence, begging for a word, a sign, anything to show I still belonged. Now, that silence had been replaced with a storm of noise, apologies that weren't real, threats that barely disguised fear, attempts to shame me into backing down. I drew a long breath. Hurt and validation tangled inside me like opposing currents. Their fury was proof. The letter had struck its mark. For once, it wasn't me scrambling to justify my existence. It was them scrambling to explain away the truth. The ringing started again, another call flashing across the screen. This time, I answered. "Nicole," a steady female voice said. "This is Delphine." I sat upright. My father's old friend, the lawyer he trusted. "I saw what you did yesterday," she continued. "And I want you to know, you're not alone." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Relief washed over me in a way I hadn't felt in years. Someone had finally said the words I needed. "You are not alone." Delphine went on. "Your father entrusted me with more than they realized. He left documents, Nicole. Legal ones. Proof of your rights. I think it's time you saw them." I exhaled shakily, pressing a hand against my forehead. "You mean they've been hiding more?" "Yes," she said simply. "And you need to be prepared. They've been trying to cut you out, not only emotionally, but financially. This isn't just about exclusion, it's about inheritance." My stomach clenched, but it wasn't fear. It was clarity. All the little acts of erasure, the cropping from photos, the locked doors, the lies about peace, they weren't just petty cruelty. They were part of a plan. "I'll meet you today," I said. We agreed on her office that afternoon. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long while, my father's words echoing in my ears. "Never forget, Nicole. You are the heart of this family." By late afternoon, I was seated across from Delphine at a long oak desk. She spread folders across the polished surface. Property titles, financial records, handwritten notes in my father's unmistakable script. I ran my fingers over one page, tracing the indentation of his pen strokes. My throat tightened. All this time, they knew. "They knew," Delphine confirmed. "But listen to me carefully. We don't strike in anger. We prepare quietly. That way, when the truth lands, it cannot be denied." I nodded slowly, absorbing her words. For years, my silence had come from fear. Fear of rocking the boat, fear of losing the scraps they threw me. But this silence would be different. It would be a weapon, sharpened by patience and evidence. Inside, something shifted. Chaos turned to strategy, sorrow to resolve. For years, I thought, I was silent because I was afraid. Now, silence is my weapon. We spent hours reviewing the documents. Every page added another layer to the truth they had tried to bury. When I finally left the office, the sky had turned to the deep colors of sunset, orange bleeding into purple above downtown Portland. I walked slowly, the city alive around me, people laughing on patios, a street musician strumming a guitar, the smell of food drifting from open doors. My old self, the woman who longed for permission, who prayed for a seat at the table, would have felt crushed under the weight of betrayal. But the new self that walked these streets carried something different. Evidence, support, power. Yes, the betrayal still stung. It always would. But I was no longer waiting for them to validate me. I carried validation in my own hands now, pressed into paper and sealed with ink. I remembered the phrase I'd once read in a history book. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I smiled faintly, my steps steady. Justice was bending, and by the time they realized what I carried in my hands, it would be too late for their excuses. Monday morning, I dressed with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. My hands didn't shake as I buttoned my coat. The bag I carried was heavy, not with clothes or trinkets, but with truth. The signed will, the hidden letter, the documents Delphine had helped me piece together. The same family that had locked doors and erased names would now be forced to sit across a table from me in a room they could not bar me from. Downtown Portland was gray with drizzle, but inside the law office, everything gleamed. The mahogany table reflected the light, papers stacked neatly at each seat, the tick of the clock punctuating the silence before words could cut. My mother sat rigid at the head, her coat draped behind her like a cape. My sibling sat beside her, tense, unwilling to meet my gaze. I walked in with Delphine at my side, and though the air thickened, I did not falter. "This is unnecessary," my mother whispered sharply, her voice low enough for me to hear, but pointed enough for everyone else to feel. I met her eyes and replied, "Truth is always necessary." The quiet was electric. Even before the documents hit the table, everyone knew something had shifted. Delphine opened the first folder with calm precision. She slid copies of the will forward, each page carrying my father's signature. "This," she said evenly, "is binding. Nothing you've done, no exclusions or omissions, can override this." My mother's voice cracked with anger. "It's old paper. Things change." Delphine didn't flinch. "The law does not change because you find it inconvenient." I reached into my bag and placed my father's letter on the table. The same paper I had held in my apartment now sat between us, his words visible in ink that time had not erased. The scrape of it against the wood echoed louder than the protests that followed. The room fell silent. My siblings leaned in despite themselves. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. I could almost hear my father's voice rise out of the letter, steady, fair, unyielding. The voice they silenced, I thought, was now speaking louder than all of them. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Nicole is a rightful heir. All previous attempts to exclude her are invalid." The words landed like a gavel. Roxalana stiffened. Sophrona gasped. Isidore shut his eyes. Shock rippled across their faces, humiliation bleeding into shame, though none of them would admit it aloud. "You've ruined everything," Sophrona muttered, her sweetness gone, her mask slipping. I turned to her calmly. "No, I've restored what was already mine." The lawyer continued, outlining the legal protections and consequences of their attempts, but I barely heard him. I was focused on the way my mother's hands tightened into fists, the way Sophrona's shoulders curled inward, the way my brother couldn't bring himself to meet my eyes. For the first time, I wasn't the erased daughter. I was recognized, officially, undeniably. A phrase I once read surfaced in my mind. The truth may be delayed, but it cannot be denied. I looked at the letter on the table and thought, delayed, yes, but never denied. When the meeting ended, I stood slowly, taking my documents with me. My legs felt lighter, my chest unburdened. As I stepped outside, the Portland drizzle had given way to a pale shaft of sun breaking through the clouds. The air was cool, but I breathed deeply, letting it fill me. Inside that office, I had been the forgotten daughter forced to argue for her existence. Outside, I was a woman who had reclaimed her dignity. Justice, I realized, was not about revenge. It was about balance. It was about truth restored to its rightful place. I walked down the street, coat pulled tight, heels clicking against the pavement. The coldness I had carried for so long began to thaw, replaced with something steadier, calmer, stronger. I no longer needed explanations, apologies, or permission. For the first time, they were the ones scrambling for excuses, and I was the one who no longer needed to explain. When I stepped back into my apartment that Monday evening, the silence felt different than it ever had before. It no longer clung to me like a punishment. It belonged to me now, and for the first time, I didn't feel caged by it. I hung my coat, set my bag down, and let the weight of the day fall from my shoulders. The air was calm, and I felt calm inside it. I filled the kettle, the soft hiss of steam rising as I prepared tea. Sitting by the window, I looked out at the Portland skyline as lights flickered to life across the city. For years, I had begged for a seat at their table, a place where my presence wasn't questioned. Tonight, I realized I had built my own table, one they couldn't take away. I thought of something I had once read. Sometimes you win simply by refusing to play their game anymore. Those words sank deep into me. I wasn't chasing their approval anymore. I sipped my tea slowly, the warmth coating my throat. Calm strength replaced the desperate longing that had driven me for years. My phone buzzed against the table, pulling me from my thoughts. Messages flooded in again, but these were different in tone. Some held weak apologies. Maybe things got out of hand. Others were manipulative, guilt woven into every line. My mother's message was sharp. "You'll regret making this public." Safrona's came minutes later. "You didn't have to embarrass us like that. You've humiliated the family." I read each one, let them sit in my mind for a moment, then set the phone down. I didn't reply. Not every battle requires words. Sometimes the loudest answer is silence. By leaving those texts unread and unacknowledged, I held the power. For years, they had thrived on my reactions, my pleas, my arguments. Now they had nothing but the echo of their own words. I smiled faintly at that thought. Later that night, I decided to walk through the city. The drizzle had lifted and the streets pulsed with energy. Families laughed as they left restaurants. Children tugged their parents toward dessert shops. Couples leaned close under lamplight. These sights reminded me of what I didn't have, but also what I no longer needed to chase. I breathed in the crisp night air and thought about what this country values: independence, resilience, the ability to stand on your own feet even when no one offers you a hand. My father's voice echoed in memory, steady and grounding. Dignity isn't given, it's carried. The pain was still there, but it no longer ruled me. It existed like an old scar, visible, sometimes tender, but no longer bleeding. My steps fell into rhythm with the heartbeat of the city. Back home, I sat at my desk and opened my journal. For months, my entries had been full of confusion and hurt, questions with no answers. Tonight, the words flowed differently. "I am not broken," I wrote. "I am freed." The pen scratched across the page as I wrote about what I had learned, that letting go of toxic bonds isn't cruelty, it's survival. That refusing to be erased is not about forcing your way back into their frame, but about framing yourself anew. There's an old idiom I thought of as I closed the journal. Sometimes you have to close a door to keep the wolves out. My family had shut doors on me, but now I understood I had the power to close my own, to protect what was left of me, to guard what I was building. As I blew out the candle on the desk and looked around my apartment, I felt a strange peace. Not joy, not triumph, but something steadier. I no longer needed their recognition. For the first time, I understood. I didn't need their table. I had built my own place to stand. Within days of the lawyer's ruling, the story spread faster than I could have imagined. Whispers carried it from church pews to grocery store aisles, from office corridors to neighborhood sidewalks. People I barely knew stopped me in passing, some with sympathetic nods, others with quiet congratulations. "Good for you, Nicole," a colleague murmured as we crossed paths in the lobby. At the farmer's market, a neighbor leaned closer. I heard what happened. Must have taken guts. I smiled faintly, though my stomach knotted with the odd mix of exposure and vindication. Truth was no longer confined to folded papers and signatures. It lived in the voices of others now, echoing in corners I hadn't expected. My family's attempt to erase me had instead painted me into the center of community conversation. I thought of an old saying: in America, reputation walks faster than footsteps. I hadn't had to tell my story. The truth had walked for me. Still, I knew this wasn't over. My family would try to soften the narrative, to downplay, to twist, and I would not let them. When the invitation came to a community gathering at the church hall, I knew it was the stage where they would make their attempt, and I knew it would be where I gave my final word. The hall was crowded that evening, folding chairs lined in neat rows, the hum of voices filling the air. My family sat together, stiff and polished. My mother, ever the orchestrator, wore her calmest mask. When the time came to speak, she stood first. "Families have disagreements," she said, her voice smooth. "We just want peace." I stood slowly, every eye turning. "Peace without honor," I said clearly, "is not peace at all." A hush fell over the room. I stepped forward, holding the letter in my hands. Not for lawyers this time, but for the witnesses of our community. I turned to my mother. "You erased me in silence. Today, I reclaim my name in the open." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of agreement, quiet nods from people who knew too well what it meant to be diminished. I unfolded the letter, my father's words steady even after years on paper. "To my daughter, Nicole, never forget, you are part of this family's foundation. What I leave behind is yours as much as anyone's." I let the silence hang. It was no longer only my voice against theirs. It was my father's, alive in ink. My sister shifted in her seat, lips pressed tight. My brother's gaze dropped to the floor. My mother's composure cracked, fury flashing across her face. But I wasn't done. I raised the letter higher. "You can cut me out of photos, but you cannot cut me out of truth. My father's words stand. And so do I." I walked to the podium, placed the framed letter there, and left it. My father's handwriting would remain in that space, visible to every eye, undeniable. My mother stood abruptly, voice rising. "Well, this isn't truth. It's disruption. You've brought shame on us." I met her eyes steadily. The shame was never mine. The room crackled with tension. Some looked away, unwilling to choose sides. Others stared openly, their nods small but deliberate. The tide had turned. They could no longer rewrite the story. Maya Angelou's words came to me then, words I had once underlined in a library book. "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies, but still, like dust, I'll rise." And so I did. I stepped back from the podium, straightened my shoulders, and rose above the chaos that swirled behind me. Let them scramble, let them shout. I was already beyond their reach. Outside, the Portland night air wrapped around me cool and clean. The weight that had clung to me for years lifted with every breath. Justice wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I walked slowly down the steps, knowing my family might never change, that they might cling to their version of order until their last breath. But I no longer needed their acceptance. To honor my father wasn't to cling to them. It was to live fully, to carry his values into my own future. I whispered into the night, "Family isn't who shares your blood, it's who stands with you in truth." And with that, I felt calm triumph settle deep within me, the kind that lasts. My independence was the victory they could never take away. They had silenced me for years, but in the end, my voice carried further than their lies, and that was my final word.